Order. Good morning. We welcome to this meeting of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Today the committee will be continuing our inquiry into proprietary ethics and the wider standards landscape. And for our first panel, we welcome the Chair of the Electoral Commission, John Pullinger, CB, and the Head of Office for Statistics Regulation, Ed Humpherson, CB. So good morning. Could you both just introduce yourselves for the record?
Good morning. I'm John Pullinger. I'm the Chair of the Electoral Commission.
I'm Ed Humpherson. I'm Head of the Office for Statistics Regulation.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much for coming here today. So interested, as an opening question, just your own perspective on why standards in public life are important and what you really see as the purpose of an effective standards system. John, would you like to kick off?
You can't have a functioning society without standards. I mean, standards are the basis for trust. And trust is, I guess you could say, the currency of social well-being. So in politics, I think in two particular areas for me stand out. First of all, standards form the basis of trust between the public and the people the public have elected to represent them. And secondly, standards form the basis of trust between political parties at election time, so they know they're facing a kind of fair crack of the whip when they're seeking people's vote. And I think those would be the two things I would highlight in an opening statement.
Thank you, John. Ed?
I don't have anything really to add to John's general answer, but if I can relate it into my world of statistics, statistics are part of the lifeblood of democracy if they're used well. If they're misused, they become slop, they become misinformation, and that can be an important driver of mistrust. And as a standards-based regulator, we set the standards to ensure that statistics are used well, and we step in when they're not used well. So to us, it's really fundamental to have those standards to provide the bedrock for the appropriate use of statistics in public life.
And what's your current assessment of the standards system in the UK at the moment?
My perspective from my specific world is it's strong. We have a very clear code of practice for statistics, which we've just extended to cover more formally the way government departments, ministers use statistics. More generally, it's very striking that when you're inside the system, you see a series of bodies that do very clear roles with clear remits. They handle cases effectively and well. I think from the outside, it might look like a little bit of an alphabet soup. And that's why I think the creation of the Ethics and Integrity Commission is such a welcome move, because I think it provides the umbrella under which all of the individual bodies, looking at appointments, looking at statistics as we do, looking at electoral behaviour, can perform. So it sort of provides the wrapper, generates the common themes, and I think magnifies the voice as well.
Thank you. John, what's your view of the current standard system in the UK?
I think, like Ed, I think a lot of the elements are there, and each element is pretty strong. But it doesn't feel to me as though, as a whole, it operates as a system as effectively as it might. And I think three things to me stand out. I mean, the first, when you look at public trust in the system, it's not as high as we want it to be. So at the very minimum, there's a job of work to give people confidence that the system as a whole will be working for them. Secondly, and again specifically on the Electoral Commission experience, there are enforcement gaps. So it is possible for wrongdoing to slip between the cracks of the system, and we need to do something about that. And thirdly, I think for those who are subject to standards, I mean, including members of Parliament, it's often quite tricky to know who you're answerable to and exactly what kind of sanctions you might face, because there are kind of overlaps and complexity that's quite difficult to understand. So the building blocks are there, but like Ed, I think the opportunity the Ethics and Integrity Commission provides is to think, how does the system as a whole work, what needs to change, and how can we make that change for the better to give public confidence the system is working properly for them.
Thank you. You've both referenced the government fulfilling its manifesto commitment to create the Ethics and Integrity Commission, which has replaced the CSPL. You've sort of given an overview of your views on the change. Sort of how well do you think that is working effectively?
I welcome the change too. I think the Ethics and Integrity Commission inherits the work of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, and I think what I would hope for is it becomes a CSPL plus. And just to expand on that a bit, I think it needs to take all the good things that the CSPL has done, and in particular the recommendations from its first ever report under Lord Nolan to establish the 7 principles of public life that I think have stood the test of time and are as relevant now as they were then. Another aspect of Lord Nolan's report that I think is as relevant now as it was then, what he called the golden threads that bring those principles to life and to make sure there is some action consequent on those principles. So the golden threads were codes of practice, codes of conduct, and I think we'll probably come back to that later, and I think there's some good work the CSPL had done, and Committee on Standards, the EIC can do more of. I think independent scrutiny is another element, and that's particularly salient to me in the Electoral Commission because independence is so critical in our work. And education is the final element of the golden threads that Lord Nolan spelt out, and I think for the public to have confidence, education of the public as to how this system works and how they can seek redress if they need it from the system, I think is going to be very important. But in that area, despite the great work of CSPL, there's definitely more to do, because I think there are problem areas. Codes of conduct for political campaigning, as an example, and we have just started some work on taking forward recommendations from the Speakers' Conference on that. But the real reason I think it needs to be CSPL plus is Lord Nolan's report was 30 years ago, and the world is very different now to what it was when the report came out. I mean, geopolitics is very much in the news at the moment, but the kind of world order we're operating in and the people who might seek to threaten us are kind of morphing and challenging, and we need to be up to the task of tackling those threats. Society has changed dramatically in 30 years, and I mean the consequences of the financial crash and the impact on people's cost of living and standards of living more generally are quite tricky. But the third one is also technology. I mean, if we didn't have any of the things we're dealing with now, and particularly the pace of technology change with AI, I think the EIC is going to need to keep abreast of those things and horizon scan where they might go next, if they're to fulfil the ambitions the government set out in the manifesto to really have a system that is right for now and gives the public the confidence that we are kind of ahead of the curve of the kind of challenges that we are likely to face in the future.
Can I just supplement that? John has alluded to the golden threads in the original Lord Nolan report, the golden threads being codes of conduct, independent scrutiny and education. And I think in all three areas, the new Commission has an opportunity, but also a challenge. It has a new role for implementing codes of conduct around the duty of candour, the Hillsborough Bill. That is really powerful and can really lead to cultural change. There's a risk, of course, that codes of conduct just become box-ticking exercises, and it's an opportunity and a challenge for the EIC to make sure that they're the good kind of code which leads to cultural change. The second of the golden threads is independent scrutiny. In my view, the new role for the Commission to write an annual letter to the Prime Minister on the standards landscape is an incredibly powerful lever. It can really highlight issues, raise challenges and drive change if it's used confidently, firmly and independently. And education, of course, is the third thing that the new EIC has as one of its new roles. What actually sits underneath that could be a very significant range of activities or not very much. I think making sure that education is effective and lands with public authorities is really important. So those three things, getting the codes of conduct landed in public authorities, using the independent scrutiny through this PM letter well, and education will be really important challenges, but also opportunities.
Thank you both. I mean, you've referenced public trust in politics at being at quite a low level, and certainly, recent events have really reinforced that. Do you think that the government's gone far enough in the EIC, or do you think they could have been bolder?
Time will tell as to how the EIC picks up its mandate, and I think Ed used some good words, acting confidently and interpreting its mandate in a way that is really going to challenge the government and challenge all of us to kind of fill the gaps and make this system much more resilient. And I particularly agree with Ed about the letter that the EIC will be writing to the Prime Minister, and I know that the EIC members are really thinking very carefully about how they use that opportunity, because it is not just an opportunity for them, it's a test for them. It's a test of whether they really are fulfilling the ambition and the desire that we have for this to be strong and effective. And time will tell. I know, working on the first version of that letter, and that will be a chance for us as regulators, but also as parliamentarians, to think, well, is this working? And if not, how do we make it work better? And we can iterate towards the kind of thing that we wanted, which is how CSPL operated too. I mean, they built on one report to get to the next report, to get to the next report. And I think that kind of cadre of evidence and experience made them immensely powerful in their later years. And we're using that as a springboard for the next steps.
Do you think the government could have been bolder?
I really essentially agree with what John has just said. And my earlier answer is my answer to your question on boldness. I think there are now the building blocks in place. The Commission, if it uses its powers, its new role with confidence, with independence, with clarity, with firmness, I think it can be really effective.
And the final question from me before I hand over to a colleague. The Nolan principles, obviously there is a lot that is still incredibly relevant. Do you think they need a refresh?
I don't think they need a refresh. I think those 7 principles are timeless, they're enduring. Of course, if we leave them on a shelf and don't think about them, they're not doing their job and we're not doing our job. What we need to do is reinterpret them into the changed context in which we now find ourselves. What does honesty mean in the contemporary environment? What does objectivity mean in our current world? What does leadership mean? Take them as enduring, but translate them into our current environment.
So not so much a refresh as maybe a re-articulation in the current environment with social media and those kind of things that the politicians are dealing with.
Absolutely. And I said earlier about things descending into box ticking. This can happen in organisations. You can go to organisations and you can see words of values printed up on the wall. If nobody's talking about them, if nobody's thinking, well, how do they actually relate to this decision I've got in front of me, or this task that I'm doing, or this project that I'm on, they don't really mean anything. So I wouldn't change any of those 7 principles, but I would really encourage, and I think this is what the codes of conduct will really help drive if they're done well, is reflection and action to make them live.
Anything you'd like to add, John?
No, I agree.
Thank you both very much. Hand over to John Lamont.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning. My first batch of questions are directed to you, John. We've discussed the creation of the EIC, and my understanding is that previously you took part in informal meetings of other standards bodies, which was chaired by the chair of the CSPL. How is this new formal sort of process working compared to what went before?
Well, firstly, I found the informal process extremely valuable. Coming in as chair to an organisation, it's quite a lonely place, and to be in a room with colleagues in a similar kind of situation was really helpful, and we shared experiences and challenges and work out how we each could live up to the Nolan principles in the fields we operate. So we've taken that into the formal network. I think formalising the network is a good thing. It makes it much more transparent and clear to people this is happening, which I think is a virtue in itself. But it also provides us with a more structured way of us bringing issues to the table where we are facing potentially common challenges. It gives us a place where we can talk about where we are working with the same group of people. You're seeing the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards immediately after this. So I work very closely with him when we're looking at financial interests of members, for example, to make sure that you face a system which is as coherent as we can make it. But I think where the network will really come into its own is a sounding board for the EIC itself, in particular thinking about which are the most prominent and salient issues for the letter to the Prime Minister. Where can it go with becoming a centre of excellence for codes of practice? And I think the network working together can really be a kind of very strong community to help the EIC kind of live up to its aspirations.
Are there any risks of the formalisation compared to the more informal process from before?
I mean, if it's informal, it has a fluidity to it. But the meetings I've been to of the formal formal network have retained that kind of essential ability to be flexible and adapt to the needs of the members. So there are risks, I think, but I think they're being well managed.
Okay. And are there other bodies that should be included within the network that aren't there just now? Size
works quite well. As we can sit in a room like this and have a conversation which flows effectively. If you have too many more people in the room, it becomes harder for it to work in the way that it is really effective. But I think what would really benefit the network, and we're starting to think about this, is where we can link into satellite networks. So there are similar networks in each of the devolved nations, and I think to work with them so we think about standards across the UK will be very important. I think an area that's possibly been neglected a bit is going down into local government in England in particular, and understanding the role of chief executives, of leaders, of monitoring officers, and how they can work out how to use the Nolan principles within the field of local government. So I think we'll have the network as it is. I would not tinker with too much, but I would really encourage it to be a kind of network that embraces other networks and enables us to kind of support and learn from local government and devolved nations in particular, but there may well be other groups. So other groups that we work with, for example, are sister regulators in the kind of political space, and that could also be an area where the EIC network could engage with.
Can I just supplement that? I think John makes a very good point about the satellite networks. Just to give an example, the Electoral Commission and the Office for Statistics Regulation form a satellite network around election time with bodies like Ofcom, the Advertising Standards Authority, and public service broadcasters around the presentation of information during pre-election campaign periods. So that's a satellite network where we wouldn't expect those bodies to attend the EIC network meeting, but we can tap into it.
I segue into my next question back to John. Beyond the network, I mean, do you think you should have any other sort of relationship with the EIS, particularly around the conduct and finance of elections?
One thing that I think was immensely valuable to the Electoral Commission with CSPL was the detailed inquiries that CSPL did. I mean, this committee has done similar inquiries, but the complementary nature of CSPL kind of enabled them to kind of think of their inquiries in this kind of standards Nolan space very particularly. So what I hope will continue is the opportunity to pick up. They mainly relate to political finance. At the moment, I'm working actively with some of the EIC members on education, and we've both referenced education already in our evidence to you this morning, and I think there is a particular role to think how we work with schools in giving children the opportunity to understand some of these questions at the earliest possible age. So I think being part of the network would enable us to think, right, so where are the different elements that we can pick up for further inquiry, and who are the other people we need to engage? And I think with Ed's point, there could be other satellites that then flow from that. So curriculum bodies would be another example.
Thanks, John. And Ed, just picking up on the networks again, I mean, what's your role, what's your view on the more formal creation of the networks compared to what went before?
I welcome it because I think it creates a stronger basis for these various organisations to share their experiences, talk about the cases that they're dealing with, the emerging issues. What the EIC will be able to do with that flow of insight is look at the landscape more coherently. So I think the formalisation just creates a stronger foundation.
But the chair of the UKSA doesn't have a formal role, although the chair attends. Is that something that should be changed, or?
I'm very happy with the chair attending. Current chair, Penny Young, represents the things that we care about as the Office for Statistics Regulation very effectively into that group. I think it's fine.
And beyond, again, the same point I made to John, beyond the role you play within the network, do you think there's another role that you should be playing beyond that in terms of monitoring the use of statistics?
Well, we monitor the use of statistics all the time, come rain or shine, during elections, outside of election times.
Particularly with the EIC.
And we have very good regular interactions with the EIC staff and with the chair, the chair who was of course the chair of the CSPL, and I will go and I will talk about this. This is something that we're dealing with. We're seeing. I thought you'd be interested to know about it from a CSPL point of view. In fact, I had a conversation with the chair yesterday, and I spoke about a case that we published last Thursday. So it's a very constant flow.
Okay, thank you. And going back to you, John, looking forward 5 years from now, how would you determine success or failure of EIC?
Well, I guess I go back to my CSPL Plus point. I think if we get to a place where some of the metrics around public trust are better, then I think in 5 years we would hope to be seeing some of those things turn around. If we get to a place where we are not drawing attention to enforcement gaps in the system because it's not clear who should take action in particular situations of wrongdoing, and if we have a system where those who are regulators or are subject to regulation really have clarity about the landscape and don't find it confusing and contradictory in the way it sometimes is now, I think those would be the three dimensions I would wish to look at.
Ed, same question.
I think in 5 years' time, if I was called back here, I would like to be able to say, look at what the EIC has achieved with the codes of conduct in public authorities. Look at the impact it's had with its letter to the Prime Minister, this independent letter on the landscape, and look at its efforts on education, both within public bodies but also within the wider public sphere. Those are things I think would be the real tests.
Surely the ultimate test is whether the public have greater faith in the process and politicians and people making decisions.
And I think we are all here for that, and we all here on the we have a sort of a theory of change, if you will, which is that doing these things will then drive increases in what are currently very low levels of public confidence in institutions and in our political system. Yes, absolutely.
And do you think, Ed, the EIC and other standards bodies are sufficiently independent of government and others?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I look at all of them and I see both in their construction, the formal setup, but also more particularly in the way that they're led. I see people who are acting independently, are willing to use their voice, and are willing to speak up about things that they are concerned about, which I think is the essence of independence.
John?
Well, I'll talk specifically from the Electoral Commission perspective here. The independence of the Electoral Commission is an absolutely vital element for the public to be confident that the Commission is acting impartially and in the interests of voters. And I think it's vitally important for parties to feel that every party is being treated consistently by the Commission in its interactions. And so for that reason, the current power that enables the government of the day to issue guidance to the Electoral Commission on its strategy and policy is kind of inconsistent with independence. And the Representation of the People Bill has its second reading here next week, and I hope the government takes that opportunity to repeal this legislation, because I think independence is necessary for the Electoral Commission to function well, and this power is inconsistent with that independence.
Okay, thank you both.
Quick question from me, and then I'll hand over to Luke Taylor and then Sam Carling. We've obviously talked a lot about restoring public's faith in politics. How can the EIC measure that?
Well, we have a whole series of tracker surveys that have got a very long history of data that enables us to kind of track the ebbs and flows of confidence, and certainly from the Commission's point of view we look at some quite precise metrics that help us understand where the gaps and challenges are, and certainly as a board we regularly discuss that when we're thinking about where we should make our priorities. And so I think we can draw on that evidence, as well as the evidence we get. We do reviews after every election, and we will get the experience of voters, we'll get the experience of candidates, we'll get the experience of electoral administrators. So we will gather the data and think, so what does it tell us? And I mean, just while I'm on that, in the last few years I've been in this job, the data point that has gone up the scale has been abuse and intimidation of candidates standing for election and other campaigners. And I think it's that data that has led us to the conclusion, well, this is a really serious problem that we need to do something about if we're to have confidence in the whole system. And we're picking that up through a code of conduct, through the Speakers' Conference and elsewhere. So I think we have the tools to do this job and to test whether we're doing it well.
Can I just add something? I'm afraid you can't ask a question about measurement of somebody who works for Office for Statistics Regulation without me getting all enthusiastic. There are a good range of measures. John has mentioned some of them. There's the British Election Study, which surveys people after each general election. There's the British Social Attitude Survey. There's a thing called the Veracity Index, which is run by Ipsos Mori, which asks people, citizens, who they trust to tell the truth. There is a whole range of measures. At present, they are all pointing to a rather concerning conclusion. So you'd look at those things. But I would also pick at something which operates at a slightly higher level. There's a very good new measure of life in the UK produced by a think tank, Carnegie UK. And one of the domains they look at is citizens' sense of democratic well-being, or whether they feel as though the democratic system that they observe represents their interests and they can influence it, and that has been showing quite low scores. And I think that sort of integrates lots of different things. It doesn't ask people directly about trust in the political system. It's asking them more broadly about their sense of their democratic stake, and I'd look at that as well. At present, all those things are showing quite, kind of unhappy picture, and I think over time we'd need to track those, and we want to see them improve.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up a couple of things, and Ed, you've given me one very in your last sentence there, I think. So, John, first of all, you talked about the independence of the Electoral Commission and the importance of that. If that is re-established and given a greater importance, do you think there's an opportunity for the Electoral Commission to revisit some of the politically driven decisions that were made under the previous government, for example voter ID, and then say actually whether that is necessary and needed and is actually impeding the people taking part in the electoral process? We've seen the statistics about the lowest turnout in the previous election, general election. With that newfound electoral independence, do you think that is newfound independence? Do you think that is something that the Electoral Commission should be looking into? How political decisions may well have impacted the progress and the running of our elections?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, notwithstanding the legislation for the strategy and policy statement, the Electoral Commission has been determined to continue acting independently, and I wouldn't still be sitting here if I felt that I was unable to act without fear or favour in the broader interests of voters. In terms of what we will do, we will use the opportunity we have after every election to monitor how well it has gone and to look at those areas where there have been problems. So I think problems that are getting in the way of people's participation, I think we are particularly concerned about, and we will continue to draw attention to that. So on voter ID, I think we will highlight where there are particular groups of people who are being disadvantaged by the voter ID requirement, and we will look very carefully at the changes to the requirement that are in the representation of the people bill to judge whether they are supporting that. But one voter turned away is one too many, and we will want to be kind of testing whether the electoral system kind of lives up to that necessity.
And just on Ed, you mentioned at the end there the study that suggested that people don't feel like democratic institutions are serving their value. Obviously, we are all watching the news, and I think the fact that we are being broadcast suggests that people might be screaming at their televisions talking about the very obvious major cases that we're seeing at the moment around misconduct in public office, and not wanting to go into too much details. Do you think that a lot of that mistrust is going to be driven by high-profile cases of unelected individuals acting inappropriately in public office? How do you see that interacting with the Nolan principles? Because you spoke of there not needing to be a revision or an update, but surely if we have such a news feed of bad behaviour, surely they're not working.
So actually it's really good that you've come back to me on this, because I was reflecting after I gave that answer about something which I should have really emphasised, because it's a really core principle for us, which is the goal is not trust per se. The goal is well-placed trust. We think about statistics. We don't want people to put their confidence in statistics which are not reliable or are not high quality. And for that reason, all of our work is about encouraging the production and use of statistics to be trustworthy, to be worthy of trust. And I think that really speaks to your point about what people can read and hear about current cases is people might be saying, well, here are a system where some of the actors are not worthy of trust. We don't want people to place their trust in that environment. That absolutely what the standards system is here to do is to prevent those things happening and call them out when they do. So I think this distinction between not seeking trust per se, but seeking people to have well-placed trust because the system is trustworthy, absolutely fundamental. So I should have clarified that. We don't want to just get those numbers up, come what may. We want to get those numbers up because the system is trustworthy.
I'm Carly.
Thank you very much. So just to go back to a couple of the questions before, we were asking around the role of the EIC. I wondered, John, if you could give some thoughts on whether the fact that the EIC is going to be taking on quite a cross-cutting strategic role across standards could create duplication with the Electoral Commission on those issues around elections, or possibly end up splitting strategy and kind of delivery of that strategy and operations into different organisations.
I don't think it will, because it's not as though the EIC has got any particular powers that intersect with the Electoral Commission. They are looking system-wide about whether the whole thing's work. So I see them more as kind of supporting us to use the powers that Parliament has given us properly and holding us to account to some extent, which is what some of the previous CSPL reports did, but also giving us the kind of benefit of the broader knowledge that they have got. So I described the existing landscape as confusing, so I think there is always a risk if you put an extra player into the room, it becomes more confusing. But in this case, I think the design has been good, that it's been designed to be a network that functions better because all the parts fit together, rather than a confusing place where you've got lots of bodies that really don't talk to each other very, very creatively. So I think we need to watch because your question is a good one, and we need to watch how it plays out. But if it goes the way it looks like it's going and the way CSPL went, I would say it's a kind of positive extra player in the room rather than a player in the room that could kind of interfere with the kind of clarity of exercise of functions that bodies like the Electoral Commission and the OSR have.
Sure, that's a really helpful perspective. And in another answer just now, you also talked about having the kind of powers and tools that you need already for a lot of your work, kind of being able to set up codes of practice and such like. But I guess there's a question around what teeth do you actually have, sort of, if a political party or a campaign group or anyone just decides to ignore those codes of practice and sort of isn't acting in good faith?
Well, so in the particular field of political finance, which is our kind of primary area of operation, I mean, we have the power to investigate and to sanction political parties or non-party campaigners that break the rules, and the rules are primarily around the transparency of donations and expenditure at election time. And certainly, if you look through the history, there are a very significant stream of cases that have generated kind of public recognition that there are sanctions there. Now, the Representation of the People's Bill revisits some of that and looks at how we can make the sanctions regime more coherent and have more bite with bigger sanctions. And I kind of look forward to the parliamentary debate on that. But we welcome those provisions in the bill. Some of them we think need some tweaking, because there are areas where we have identified, along with CSPL, loopholes, particularly around the risk of foreign money coming into the system, and checks on individual donors I think need to be strengthened, and the bill suggests they will. Proportionate checks on unincorporated associations are another area where the bill tackles quite well. The area where we would like to see us strengthening is on donations made by companies, and the bill again tackles this area, but it proposes a measure at the moment which we think is a little weak, and we would prefer the bite to be on companies should not donate more into politics than they have to profit. Profit is linked to tax, and if you're paying tax, you feel a bit more like paying tax in Britain, you're a British company. Other measures we think might give less clarity to the public. But the sanctions around those kinds of things are kind of very significant for the bill. I know this committee is going to come back, and I guess we'll be in this room talking about it again. But there are sanctions there at the moment. There are loopholes and weaknesses in the level of sanctions. The bill is hoping to address some of those. We've drawn attention to them. CSPL has drawn attention. This committee's drawn attention to them, actually. And I think the test now will be for the government and Parliament to make sure that the bill, when it's passed, really does kind of follow through and make sure the sanctions achieve the objectives that I think your question suggests we need.
Sure, thank you. That's really helpful. And just to kind of move on to a slightly different area, in your written evidence, you've talked quite a bit about how the Electoral Commission works to ensure public confidence in the democratic system as a whole. Can you give us more of a sense of how you do that and how you're measuring your success?
So, I mean, two areas, one kind of very practical and one a little bit more strategic. I mean, the very practical area is in advance of every election we will be doing public awareness campaigns. We're cranking up now for the May elections, and the team are kind of very busy working on the general elections in Scotland and Wales, and the quite significant number and variety of elections we've got taking place in England. So a key part of us giving public confidence is giving them real clarity of how do you register to vote, where your polling stations are, all of those kinds of things, working in concert with local authorities to make sure there's a good understanding. But in terms of confidence, very specific campaigns, so campaigns targeted in the area of your vote is yours alone, to give people the confidence that they can vote in secret. They should not be subject to any kind of coercion by another person, and we consider that to be very vital. We get good feedback on those. So that's something we would do at each election time, because that's when it's in people's minds, and that's the moment where I think you need to give them that confidence. And we talked earlier about some of the metrics. The metrics around public confidence in whether elections are well run is and remains very high. It's one of the best metrics, and we would worry if that were to dip. And so we will always be looking at that. More strategically, I think we see education as being the kind of critical thing for public confidence, because we are aware from our research amongst young people in particular, there is a very high level of desire to know more about politics and understand it. And yet a massive gap at the moment in people's understanding and participation in terms of younger people, but even more generally. And we think education is the most obvious way to fill that gap, particularly in schools and in further education. but I think also more generally in kind of civic society to think about ways we can work with community organisations and others to realise that to be able to vote is to have a voice in the way your community is run, and that voice is real and it matters, and if you want to say something, politics is the way to get it said in a way that will actually make action happen. Then the challenge of course is for politicians to make sure that then those decisions are made in the interest of voters, and voters then see that.
I mean, you mentioned the kind of statistics on how well-run elections are and how people feel about that, which I guess is really important. But there is also, as you say, how people feel about the democratic system and trust in politics and the process more generally, where I think there's a lot more concern. So can I just ask again, in terms of when you're measuring your success, which set of metrics are you kind of primarily focusing on?
We will look at quite a wide range of metrics. I mean, the high-level metrics about people's confidence in whether elections have been well run is an important high-level one, but you see very significant differences amongst people who voted and people who don't vote. So I think the concern about participation rates dropping off makes us really want to focus our attention on those who aren't voting and why. And some of that is very much down to lack of trust or lack of feeling that there's anyone who represents them, or there is someone out there who will actually be likely to act in their interests if they were elected. So that then tempts us to start working with committees like this to think, so how do we make people understand politics better so they have more confidence in it and want to take part? But we'd also look at things much more precisely. So public confidence in the transparency of political finance is one that we would look at very closely, and that is one of the worst metrics we look at. It's extraordinarily low, and yet we have arguably one of the most transparent systems in the world. Donations and expenses, as you know, we collect them pretty rigorously and we make sure they are there for the public to scrutinise. The problem there is the public then sees it, and if they see things they don't like, then they want something to happen as a consequence. And I think it's that element that we would want then to highlight. So what is actually going on with the pattern of donations at the moment is just causing the public to distrust it. So this data helps us home in on the particular points. I talked earlier about the data we also collect from candidates, and abuse, intimidation and threats is a particular element there, and we were working with the Joe Cox Foundation announcing yesterday work that they are doing with the devolved administration. So we will think, who else can we work with to ensure that issues of concern, particularly relating to trust, are kind of brought to public and parliamentary attention, and then we can have debates like this about what then needs to happen.
Thank you. Luke Taylor.
Thank you. So we've talked about, and you've used the quote already because it's actually quite a good one, is how statistics are the lifeblood of democratic debate, and the misuse of statistics results in an erosion of trust, not just in government but also in all of politics. So have you got any examples of how that has been manifested in whether it's election campaigns, whether it's government statistics, whether it's political parties pushing particular narratives? Is there anything that you've seen that particularly concerned you?
We sort of operate on the basis of we want statistics to be a lifeblood of democracy, of democratic debate. There are things which threaten that outcome, and we regard our code of practice as putting in place the safeguards to mitigate those threats. So we've got lots of examples of interventions we've made to make sure that the safeguards work, the safeguards of appropriate use, of equality of access, of intelligent transparency, of trustworthiness and heads of profession. So I wouldn't want to pick out any particular example as being more egregious than any others. We see effectively three types of misuse. The rarest is a straight up error, when a reference to a statistic in public debate is erroneous. The second kind is a lack of transparency, where statistics are quoted, but it would be very hard for a citizen or indeed another politician to really verify where those numbers came from and what they mean. And the third kind, and probably the most serious category, is misleadingness, when a statistic is used in a misleading way. And I can give you examples of all three if that would help. So an example of a straight-up error, which involved us writing to the then Prime Minister, was Boris Johnson in 2022 saying that there were more people in work after the pandemic than before. And the letter that went to him said, it is wrong to say there are more people in work after the pandemic than before. And we actually said, that is wrong. It was an erroneous statement. That is actually very rare. The vast majority of our cases are actually in this space of transparency. And to give an example with the current Prime Minister, in his conference speech at the Labour Party conference in 2024, he referred to some progress that the government was making on an aspect of the immigration system, and he quoted a number. The number was correct. It was drawn appropriately from the statistical evidence, but the underlying data wasn't due to be published until November. So at the point that he said it, it was not transparent because nobody could access the number that he was referring to. We wrote to the Prime Minister highlighting the importance of only using numbers in the public domain, and we worked with the Home Office to require the Home Office to publish the data promptly because he had put them into the public domain. And then misleadingness, a fairly recent example. Last year, second half of last year, the then Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs said that water pollution was worse in Scotland than in England, and then presented some numbers to back up this claim. This was referred to us, we looked into it, and whilst the numbers that were used were correct, they passed the first test, and they were transparent in the sense that anybody could access them. Actually, if you looked at the full range of evidence on the question of water quality in England as against Scotland, you would not conclude that water pollution was worse in Scotland. So we said this was a very significant risk of being a misleading presentation of statistics. So we see examples of that all the time. In this current year, we've handled 141 cases, so we're quite active. Previous years, it's been over 200 cases. So there's a lot of examples. Can I just say one final thing? I'm sure you've got some follow-ups. Every one of these interventions has two effects. The first effect is we want to clarify the use of those particular statistics in that particular context. The examples I've given, we stepped in to clarify in that particular moment what's the appropriate use of statistics. And that's sort of, in a sense, correcting the risk of misunderstanding that issue. But more importantly, we make the intervention to reinforce the principles and the safeguards of having heads of profession in departments, having chief analysts who are responsible for signing off the use of statistics. So the intervention is not just on the particular issue, it's reinforcing a system of safeguards. And it's actually, I think, the latter which is the more powerful intervention that we make.
Do you have any examples of good practice where an organisation or a particular use of statistics has built trust? Because whilst we want to stop undermining trust with poor use of statistics, where have you seen that actually improved and done in a positive way?
Well, can I give you two examples? Actually, one is on a specific thing, and the other is absolutely this kind of systemic factor that I've just described. The specific issue is the Treasury, when they publish the budget, they publish a document alongside it called data sources. And if you look at that data sources document, right at the beginning they say, we do this to comply with the Office for Statistics Regulations Code of Practice and Intelligent Transparency. And then for every number that is in the budget, they disclose the source and say how they got to it. It's tremendous practice. It really reinforces the ability for people to scrutinise, understand and verify. So that's a very specific thing. The general thing is we did a review of intelligent transparency in government last November, and we had some case examples of good practice, and one of them was the Department for Business and Trade, which has established an internal committee in effect to fact check its own use of statistics. So anything which goes out from that department will have been through this review panel made up of its analysts and its statisticians to make sure that they are not misrepresenting statistics on business and trade. Really, really good, strong practice. Exactly the kind of safeguard that we're here to reinforce.
So, and you mentioned it very briefly, but the powers or the practice that you have to highlight both poor use and, in this case, positive use, do you think you have sufficient powers, audience, visibility to, I suppose, jockey on the rest to see that best practice, to see that, you know, where positive trust is being generated by those behaviours?
Well, yes and no. So the yes bit is that in all of the cases I've mentioned, and in many other cases, I can demonstrate how our intervention has produced this dual impact of clarifying the particular issue and reinforcing a system of good practice. So in that sense, I think we have a really good, clear story of impact. But your question wasn't quite on impact, it was also on visibility and whether our voice is sufficiently heard. And I think there's always more to do there. And you will know as a committee I've been before you in the context of the ONS and the ONS's performance. And I think I made the point very openly to you as a committee that number one, we made all the right judgments at the right time, but number two, we probably didn't convey them with enough clarity and directness. And that's an ongoing challenge that we, I'll be humble about that. I think we need to do more.
Let's not get into the whole ONS conversation again, but no, thank you. I think you've answered the questions I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Lamb.
Thank you. Mr. Humpherson, you have specified that you believe the ministerial code should not only be required to comply with, they should be required to comply with it, not merely be mindful of it. Could you set out your reasons for believing that should be the case?
Yeah, well, being mindful, I think, has an air of voluntarism, an air of this is something you might want to consider, but it's really not that important. I think making ministers comply, as we expect departments and civil servants within departments to do, will both symbolically strengthen the commitment amongst ministers to appropriate use of statistics, but also give us more leverage when a concerns are raised. So I think it would be a really, really good change to the ministerial code to say not just be mindful, but comply with the code of practice for statistics, as we expect from other public servants.
I mean, this committee has dealt with various questions around the ministerial code over the last year and a half, including at the request of the Speaker. The ministerial code is, of course, the Prime Minister's own code that he sets out. It is within his power to modify it or to enforce it. In order for it to be something that ministers are required to comply with, would you envisage further changes to that? Perhaps that the document becomes a document of the House rather than of the Prime Minister?
Anything which can reinforce these standards, I would support. Although, to be honest, my ambition is constrained simply to getting appropriate recognition for the Code of Practice for Statistics in the Ministerial Code. The strengthening of the Ministerial Code itself, I think, is more for this committee to take forward.
Is the mechanism for ensuring that the statistical part is protected that I'm really inquiring about? One of the concerns this committee has had, or some members of this committee have had, talking to yourselves and to your colleagues in regulatory roles over the last year and a half, has been, it seems that much of our system is still heavily dependent upon the belief that everyone in the system is of good mind and intention and has a sense of shame. You are the first person we've come across that seems to believe that there should be some further strengthening in these areas in terms of mandating ministers rather than simply requiring them to act out of good faith in line with the rules. To what do we attribute the reason that you've taken a stronger position on this compared to your colleagues?
Maybe I'm just a miserable old cynic, I don't know. Possibly the reason for that is that we've worked in this field for a long time. We've built up a regime for the appropriate production and use of statistics. And what we see is that good, well-intentioned policymakers can be tempted into using statistics inappropriately, not because they don't have good intentions, but because they're just in an environment of media pressure or a 24-hour news cycle, or they feel they need their message to cut through. They're in policymakers are in a difficult and challenging environment, and so for that reason, simply appealing to good intentions is I mean, it's going to work in many situations, but in some situations it's not going to be sufficient, because the temptations to use evidence in a way which is erroneous or not transparent or misleading, those temptations are there. And that's why our starting point is there are threats and you need safeguards against those threats. That's the whole system that we run. And I really reject the idea that, I know you didn't say this, but other people might say our system has assumptions of that it's all about good chaps. I mean, in a sense, it's almost the reverse. We assume that people with good intentions can misuse statistics despite themselves, and that's why we have the system that we have.
Should there be greater regulation in this area for other public office holders rather than simply members of the government?
Well, I mean, the system that we have for statistics doesn't really single out ministers. Statistics are a product of a system of actors. There's statisticians who compile the statistics. There's policymakers who decide to use them to justify a policy. There are the communications professionals who put together the messaging. There are the ministers who, as it were, speak the words and represent them in Parliament and in the media. There's a whole range of people. We don't really single out ministers specifically. We want that whole system to work effectively and appropriately.
But there's no safeguards in dealing with those other public. I mean, if I was to start spouting off statistics that I'd made up or was misquoting, whereas a minister would be subject to being required to comply with the ministerial code, it hasn't got a level playing field there for the government compared to other individuals in public office. I
would hope after meeting me you'd be so intimidated that it would never cross your mind to do such a terrible act. If you as a member of Parliament were to start misusing a statistic, and there are examples of this, the first thing we do is we contact your office and we say we've seen this, we don't think that's right, and we will raise it with you. And the initial approach would be informal, but if it persists, we would make our view public. So we don't distinguish as a member of Parliament. It's the statistics which matter, not the speaker, the person who's doing the speaking.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'll just throw it open to any remaining members of the committee if they'd like to come in. No? Excellent. Well, that concludes our first panel. Can I thank you both for your comprehensive responses and for your time today? Thank you very much. Brilliant. So for our second panel, we now welcome the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, Daniel Greenberg, CB, and the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, Paula, Sussex, CBE. Good morning to you both. Thank you for your time. Could you both just introduce yourselves briefly for the record?
Good morning, Paula, Sussex, Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman.
Daniel Greenberg, Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards.
Excellent. Thank you both for being here this morning. For an open question, if I could start with you, Daniel. What do you see as the purpose of an effective standards system, and what is your current assessment of the system that we have here in the UK?
The only purpose of the standard system is trust between the public and the political class generally, between the public and the establishment. Everything that we do here by way of maintaining standards can sensibly be benchmarked against. Does it enhance trust? Does it damage trust? And I honestly don't think I can do better by way of elaboration than to stick with that word, trust.
Thank you. Paula?
I think I mostly agree with Daniel. So trust is enormously important to us at PHSO. But I think we do also need benchmarks, a way of measuring it, a way of defining it. So without banging on for too long, Nolan is great. They are great, comprehensive, very, very clear. To go to your second point, what is our view of the system of standards at the moment? I think we can all conclude that there has been an implementation gap. So the standards are there, they are clear, but the way in which they have been operationalised throughout the wider public service, as is a matter of public record for PHSO, we do not believe that that has been done as well as it could have been. And in 2023, we called for a review of how that has been done in health. Very happy to talk more at length of what we see of the implementation gap, from which we need to take lessons for the implementation as we go forward, potentially, of the Public Office and Accountability Bill.
Thank you. Do you want to elaborate now on the implementation gap?
Very happy to do that. So we see some of this evidence coming through in our casework, and of course we're looking just here at health. Looking at I think they are interim findings of the review, research-based. The dominant themes came through that where there were deficiencies in the way in which it's been implemented in health, it relates to the culture of the organisation, not having these standards at the forefront of everybody's minds, inconsistency of applying the duty of candour, and then the third theme was the lack of training. I look forward to the review being finalised. It will give us a clue as to how we go forward.
Thank you. Just more broadly, mention the Nolan principles. Earlier in the session, we heard that there might need to be, or there's an argument perhaps for a re-articulation in the current environment that politicians are operating in, social media, the kind of pressures that didn't necessarily exist when the Nolan principles were first sort of codified, obviously giving the view that the central substance behind them, the principles behind them, are as relevant as ever. Daniel, do you have a view on that? Whether there's a need to sort of re-articulate some of those principles for the modern age?
I don't see it. I don't deny others may see it, and obviously the Committee on Standards is likely to have a view on this, and they're possibly better placed than I am. But I think the Nolan principles work, they're clear, they're, as you say, Chair, they are still clearly relevant to the pressures that you face, albeit the pressures are different. And when I do parliamentary outreach, and I see it as a very important part of my role to discuss with the public, with students and others, their view of how they can trust the institutions. The benchmarks of and I accept they're not empirical benchmarks in the way that others are, but as benchmarks of trust, students and others seem to get them, very clearly: objectivity, selflessness, integrity even, which is quite wide. People get it and understand it. So My feeling in my own work is that they are serviceable, they're well understood, and that they cover what is necessary.
Thank you. Paula?
I agree. I think they are absolutely standing the test of time. But I think going back to something that, Chair, I think you might have been alluding to in the first session, we do live in a communications age. And, I hesitate to say maybe they need a bit of a marketing relaunch, but there is something about the way in which we communicate these throughout the nation. They are solid. They are absolutely solid.
Thank you both. The government's fulfilled its manifesto commitment to create the Ethics and Integrity Commission by replacing the Committee of Standards in Public Life with the EIC. What are both of your views on that change? Daniel, would you like to start?
Firstly, I very strongly welcome the establishment of the Commission. One of the things that I do sense that we need in terms of enhancing trust in standards generally is more coherence, more feeling of there's an overarching sense, a holistic understanding of how standards are applied across the whole of the public service. If I could give you an example, Chair, when members of Parliament ask me, as they occasionally have done, is it proper for them to write a letter in support of a national honour for a constituent who's been a donor to their campaign, I say I don't think it is proper, because it would not be in accordance with selflessness, objectivity, and it would be improper, and then they don't do it. Now, it could be argued that that very clear principle is somehow undermined if, for example, political parties are seen to be rewarding major donors to the parties with peerages. If that were seen to be happening, that could be seen to be undermining the message that I'm giving. So I welcome the fact that we now have a body that is able to take an overarching view of principles like selflessness, objectivity, integrity, honesty, as well as openness and transparency, and indeed leadership, and give some direction and coherence to the application of those principles across the whole of the public service. So I very strongly welcome the establishment of the Commission. I think it will be able to build on the work of its predecessor, which was also very important and highly valued work, and I think it will massively contribute towards trust if it is able to give a feeling of coherence to the public service standards as a whole.
Thank you. You've quite eloquently set out how you think it can improve things in terms of providing clarity and coherence to the standard system. Do you think it provides opportunities for simplification?
I think that's probably it's probably a bit too early to tell how much that's possible. Certainly the Committee on Standards, as your committee will know, made the previous committee before the election, produced a landscape report, and again the Committee on Standards will be able to tell you more about that if you want, but there was definitely a feeling in that report that the overarching standard system is very difficult for people to understand. I very much agree with what Paula said a few moments ago about the importance of communicating clearly to the public what the system is, and complexity is obviously a barrier to clear communication. So I wouldn't want to prejudge how much they can do. Is it something that we should all be looking at and that the Commission should be able to help with? I hope so.
Thank you. Paul, anything you'd like to add?
Very much agree with that. I think going back to implementation, operationalising, with sort of slight apologies for sort of programme management language, but, you know, the devil is always in execution. The more that EIC can take that proactive role, not the reactive role of translating the standards, and then just to build on Daniel's point, yes, absolutely, working with all of the related bodies, in a sense exactly what you as a committee are trying to do, to say, what's your part in this? How do you knit into this creation of a culture where a public servant, chief executive of a trust, a DG, a CEO, an accounting officer, thinks first, is this the right thing to do? Does this feel right? And that the focus is on building that that language rather than something has gone wrong, now what do we do, and what's the offence against which we assess what's happened.
Thank you, that's helpful. That sort of touches on some reflections from the last session, I think, where it seems it to be quite a delicate balance in terms of restoring public trust in politics and our institutions between preventing bad behaviour and then when bad behaviour happens, ensuring that the public can see that there's a punishment for that bad behaviour. So a question for you both, really. Do you think in your respective positions that the government and the EIC, we've got that balance right in focusing on prevention versus making sure the remediation acts as a deterrent and is part of restoring faith in our institutions?
It's a very difficult balance, public trust and confidence. And again, it is also played out in the communication age, which makes it even more complex. I think two particular cases, I've been in post since, or I've been with the organisation since August, two particular cases, if I can, stick in my mind. One which is, a negative, and one which perhaps is more positive. So one is the case which was quite fundamental to the duty of candour of health, which is the case of a gentleman called Will Powell and the avoidable death of his son, Robbie, where 36 years ago, there was clear evidence of falsification of evidence in health and wider as related to the avoidable death. And through relentless advocacy, that has given us, and is also a bit of a North Star for me on the duty of candour as it potentially comes down the road after the bill is made an act. The second one, more recently, which points to how the public can have trust in the state, is one example that we've made some communication of, which relates to the Windrush compensation scheme, where a particular victim, a gentleman called Thomas Tobier, persisted and took his complaint after local resolution was not satisfactory with the Home Office, and took us to us at the Ombudsman. And working with the Home Office, we identified that he was right, that there was a flaw in the scheme that related to compensation and taking into account private pension loss. Working with him and the Home Office and the Windrush Commissioner, we were all able to say we need to address this and change the scheme. And insofar as the public have observed this, I think they should see that as raising trust. The state will listen, multiple units of the state will listen again to a citizen who had faith that someone would listen. And then if the citizen is right, we will change the system, we will listen to the benefit of others. So you can both have stories of some remediation which have an unhappy end, which create some good, but it's also important to celebrate the good when it is happening in public service.
Thank you. And Daniel, do you have views on whether we're getting it right in terms of the focus on prevention versus remediation?
Obviously, I only speak from my very narrow role within the House, but I recognise and reflect what Paula has just said, and I would add a word to celebration of the good. It's also encouragement of the good, because I felt, which I think is part of what Paula is describing, I felt from when I took up my role that it was really important that the standard system in the House is not seen as a series of things not to get wrong or a series of breaches waiting to happen, so to speak, but is seen as a very inspiring and practical agenda or manifesto even for individual politicians as to how they should show that they do what they do really well. And as you may know, Chair, I run Principles in Practice, Nolan Principles seminars with staff for members here. And I work on helping them to see how so much of what they do is really putting those principles into practice in a very positive and inspiring and trust-inducing way. So I think we should always, this isn't saying whether we've got the balance right or wrong, because I don't think it's necessarily a binary sort of sum, but I do think we should always be putting as much emphasis on as possible on encouraging and displaying what good practice looks like, of which there is an enormous amount around in the House and elsewhere in the public service, as well as effectively and properly enforcing sanctions against bad behaviour.
Thank you. I guess the media is just always a little bit more interested, aren't they, when things go wrong than when things go right?
Yes, I have to say, Chair, I've actually found the media quite fair. Of course, you know, MP sits in her office doing her work is not going to be front page news. But I have found that the media, when given helpful and solid stories of information about things working well, they do their best. That's my impression.
Thank you both. Parliament.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning to you both. Daniel, my first few questions are going to be directed to you. The EIC now has a more formal role in terms of coordinating the network of standards bodies. Previously, you took part in the more informal arrangements that the CSPL coordinated through the chair. How do you reflect in terms of how the more formal process? Do you prefer the structure now compared to what happened before?
Again, it's too early, I think, to give any kind of a mature judgment on that. Perhaps I can answer your question more by reference to my expectations and impressions than any kind of judgment after the event. I think it is. I think it's a good thing that we haven't set out to try and simplify the arrangements, as the Chair mentioned before, by creating another overlapping body. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the resourcing and capacity of the body is obviously not a matter for me, and it's something that you will be examining for yourselves. I think the one thing that I have stressed at the beginning is that I very much welcome the opportunity to collaborate and cooperate with the Commission, and I think it has enormous potential for bringing much needed coherence to the public standards generally. What I have to ensure that I do is I maintain your independence, Parliament's independence, as part of that process. At the end of the day, the Commission is a creation of the government. I am an officer of the House, and I collaborate and cooperate with the Commission enthusiastically, very much expecting it to do a lot of good, but always remembering that I represent the interests of you, the self-regulating House, and not of the government.
Okay, that's helpful. And is there a wider range of bodies that should be included within the network?
Look, again, it's not for me to say. What I would say, the only thing I would say is that when discussing, whether it's you or whether the Commission, when you're deciding which bodies to add, or whether there are any bodies to draw within the network, I think the overarching question for you is, again, will it enhance trust and coherence? And I'm not going to look at a body and say, therefore, that yes, that no, but I would hope that will be your guiding principle in discussing that with the Commission, and I hope it would be the Commission's guiding principle in determining who to bring within its network.
Paula, would you like the PHSO to be included?
We already work very closely with Doug and his team. Quite possibly it'd be sensible to join the network, particularly as we move forward on the bill. But we work very closely with him at working level and at my level with him.
What would be the advantage for you formally joining the network?
There is, in other parts of our remit, John, we are working as closely as it can. I always describe it as the jigsaw and working out where you can achieve, a terrible word, but symbiosis. So in other parts for me, that's CQC, NAO, GIAA. Here it would be a similar thing to work out where, where we can get that 1 + 1 = 3, and just to be cognizant of how we all, interact, and also for it to be able, I mean, Daniel, I think, doesn't have a contact centre. I'm going to guess you don't, Daniel. But when we have members of the public ringing us to say, you know, we have this issue, I have this complaint, where do we go? It enables us to help them navigate the system better.
Thank you.
Sam Carling.
Thank you very much. And Daniel, I think you sort of touched on this topic just now, but I'll ask the question anyway. We have a setup now where the EIC has been set up and has had its scope in terms of reference set by government, but it has a remit to cover standards all across public life, including to Parliament. Is it appropriate for a government-sponsored body to have a remit over Parliament like that?
So I think a lot will depend on what is meant by remit and what is understood by remit. I'm sorry to be predictably boring in this session by constantly repeating coherence and trust, but I do think coherence really is what is lacking in relation to trust and public standards, and I think any kind of sort of separatist attitude on my part would be incompatible with embracing the opportunity for greater coherence. But you're right, I have sort of touched on this in the answer I gave before. It is very important that Parliament collaborates, participates in this exercise, recognising all the time that Parliament is and must be independent. The House of Commons must be self-regulating, but of course it does that in a way by appointing me and giving me operational independence to show that MPs are not just marking your own homework, but you've got an element of independence, but within a constitutional framework of self-regulation and independence from government. So I think perhaps the best way I can answer your question is to say that I think it will be a constant balance, and I have no reason to believe that it's not a balance that can be struck and maintained.
Yes. Thank you both very much. Just interested, sort of winding up this section on the EIC, what both of your views are in terms of what success and failure look like for the EIC.
I think, like all of us, we would all like to see an increase in, as colleagues before were saying, the very many ways of measuring public trust. And I'm sure if we see that nudging north, which is what we all want, EIC, we should be hopefully able to see, you know, the cause and effect there. In the meantime, I think actually, I'll borrow your phrase, Daniel, the coherence. That jigsaw that I talk about, there should be no gap, underlap, overlap, and that is something that certainly can be achieved. So if you took all of the bodies in this hearing currently in the network, that they are clear as to how they interact, what their roles are, and how they can help each other as well.
I very much agree with that. I would add only this. In terms of success and failure measurements, I often say to members of Parliament that in the same way that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference, the opposite of trust is not suspicion, it's disengagement. And we have a massive problem in this country, which I think we share with many countries around the world today, of disengagement on the part of many of the people who we want to be most involved in our political life. And if I were asked to advise in any sense the Commission in our work of what we should be regarding as one of the indicators of success, it would simply be engagement. Do people think it matters? Are people coming along? And if you will permit me, Chair, engagement meaning two-way engagement. And I think in Parliament sometimes we're quite good at communicating, but that's not engagement, that's communication. And I would like to think that we will find ways, through the Commission and in other ways as well, of making real two-way engagement so that people feel ownership of the system as well as trust in it.
I agree. Listening is a very underrated skill in politics, I have found. Thank you both very much. I'm just wondering, particularly Daniel, with your experience, are there any countries that have kind of, I appreciate that some of the distrust that we're seeing is sort of being played out across a lot of Western democracies at the moment. Are there any examples from other countries where they've had low levels of trust in government, in their public institutions, and through some changes to the standards landscape, they've been able to show, through the kind of metrics that some of the panelists in the first session were talking about, show that upward trajectory, show that they've been able to turn the dial in improving public confidence. Is there anyone we can look to?
I don't know. It may be that the Constitution Unit in UCL, who I imagine you've either had evidence from, or I'm sure you're in touch with them, the Constitution Unit may well, they did some very important work on public trust not that long ago and produced some very valuable reports. And I would not be surprised if they did some comparative analysis as part of that. So they may well be able to help you on that, and I agree it would be interesting.
Thank you very much. Question for Paula now. You've talked a little bit about how you're engaging with the EIC, but how do you see the PHSO's role in relation to the upholding of standards and trust in government and public life a bit more widely?
So the first thing to say is we're not technically a standards body, but we do operate in this sort of the general understanding of it. This committee particularly will know that our prime focus is on maladministration and is there injustice, and you will also know that our intent, indeed our current focus is absolutely moving towards where that is having a systemic effect, so the impact that we want to have on public service. So, we attend to, if you like, standards which relate to performance, competence, but honesty is a really important part of that. And if you look at certainly things like our principles of good administration, back to Daniel's point about coherence, you will see quite some overlap with effectively some of the Nolan principles, recast. So it's hugely important to us. Duty of candour, again, if it comes through in the bill, is going to be extremely important to us. We will be part of operationalising it. And mostly the discussions that we've had with Doug and his team are about how we can work with them, support them as they draft the guidance for the codes of conduct. Similar exercise to the work that we did with complaint standards in health, complaint standards in government.
Thank you very much. Sam Carling.
Thank you. So before the 2024 election, excuse me, the Standards Committee described the parliamentary standards landscape in a report as being complicated but having a logic behind the complexity. So, Daniel, I just wonder if you could give us a sense of whether you think the system is well enough understood, firstly by people within Parliament, but also the general public more broadly.
Do I think it is well enough understood?
Yes.
No, I don't. I think, as you say, that the Committee on Standards went into considerable detail about the complexity of the system, and to be honest, it would be astonishing if it were well understood, either internally or externally. And the chair early on in the session raised the question of simplification, and I agree that's something we should constantly be keeping an eye on. The other part of the picture is education, and we have done, I think, a fair amount within Parliament to try and improve the amount of information we disseminate. Paula mentioned in her evidence, she mentioned the importance of sending people in the right direction when they contact you and you're not the right port of call. I think that's really important. We also get a lot of communications that are not something I can do anything about, and I think it's really important never to say to somebody just, not for me, go away. You try and say, not for me, go away, and here are some places you might go to. And sometimes if you decide that actually there's no one that can help somebody, it's also quite helpful to communicate that. So we are doing what we can. I think Parliament is doing what it can in terms of information and dissemination. The Committee on Standards definitely had that in mind when it produced its report. Have we got to a system where I could say to you, yes, it's fine, everybody knows what's going on? Of course not. No.
No, that's very helpful. And I suppose off the back of that and some earlier comments you've made as well, do you think there needs to be some more coordination in standards and reporting regimes across sort of Parliament, government and other areas of public life? I'm particularly thinking, I suppose, between the interaction with the ministerial code and the government compared to parliamentary standards and how they mesh together.
So I think as a general principle, yes, that, as I've said, that's definitely one of the things that I am hoping will come out from the Commission. They'll be able to provide a degree of coherence. In relation to alignment of some of the rules, which would definitely make it easier for people, make it simpler and easier for people to understand, that is something that I have been trying to advance since I took up the role. In successive annual reports, I've had to admit that I've had less success than I would like. This is something that I report on regularly to the Committee on Standards, and it is something that I hope the Commission will provide an opportunity to pursue. So, yes, where there is opportunity for alignment, we should be taking it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So both of your officers are obviously identifying where mistakes and transgressions have taken place. Obviously, that's having quite a negative impact on trust in politics. Daniel, I'm just wondering, in particular, the number of inquiries your office carries out and the number of times you've sort of made the step of referring a matter to the Standards Committee is actually very low. But do you know why there is that transgression or that big gap between public perception and findings of transgressions?
So, I mean, the starting point is that my remit in opening public investigations is set out in the House's standing orders, and the process for it is set out again and published in the interests of transparency in the House-approved procedural protocol. And that includes the matters, very clearly, the matters that I can and can't investigate. In summary, I can only look at complaints if they're within my remit, if I've been given sufficient evidence, which can be an issue, and if an investigation is justified and proportionate, and proportionality is an important issue. Of course, the House has given me powers to rectify a large number of cases, and again, this is done openly on the website for the public and everybody to see. And where I decide that a breach is minor or is inadvertent, I have power to rectify not all breaches, but most kinds of breach myself, if the member agrees to a rectification, and then those never go to the committee. Now, I see those as success stories, because in my view, I would much rather reach a consensual position where a member acknowledges that there may have been a minor or an inadvertent failure, they apologise to the House through me, they agree a package of rectification measures to prevent recurrence. To me, as a regulator, that's what success looks like. And so I think it's important not to sort of measure success even in relation to the implementation, even in relation to enforcement, by how many reports the committee is asked to produce into wrongdoing. I think and of course, even before you get to rectification, the standing orders also give me power to give words of advice, which are confidential words of advice, and that again is a power set out in standing orders. So there's quite a lot under the surface, and I think, again, coming back to the member's point about the importance of people understanding, perhaps we could do more to disseminate an understanding of all the activity that takes place within the standards regime here that does not result in a formal public investigation.
Thank you. And Paula, you sit at the end of a much larger complaints process for maladministration in government and the NHS and other public bodies. Do you think there's a similar gap between public perceptions of and the reality of maladministration across the UK?
Well, so I mean, the first thing to say is that it shouldn't be missed from this hearing that we are seeing an unprecedented increase in the number of complaints coming to us, 25 to 30% this year. And many of my colleagues in the other Ombudsman schemes are seeing the same, which implies that there is a good deal of pain out there. Do I think there is a gap? Yes, possibly yes. I go back to the communications age. I was just thinking, listening to Daniel, by definition, we will be producing more, closing more complaints. We usually uphold or partly uphold to the rate of about 60%. We're producing more, we're more productive, we're publishing more. So therefore, on our website, there will be more tales of transgressions. So if you are a member of the public who's on our website day in, day out, you could be believing that it's all a bit depressing. But we do see many examples of very good practice, and going back to how we communicate those and celebrate, I think is the word that we use, where good public servants in both of our jurisdictions are absolutely doing the right thing, are absolutely monitoring the voice of the patient or the citizen at the board table, at the non-executive table, and listening to their customer, then it's it comes to us to make sure that we get those stories out, as well as inevitably all of the publications of where public service has gone wrong. So balance in the communications is going to become even more important as there's even more business for the Ombudsman.
I'll bring Marcus in just a second. Just a quick question of clarification. That 25-30% increase you were talking about in complaints, is that predominantly in the NHS? Is that, do you know, what's the breakdown in terms of where you're seeing those?
I mean, roughly 80% of our work is 80%, as I think you know, Chair. But there isn't a driver. It's quite spread across the jurisdictions. But we are now doing a detailed piece of work to try and get underneath that increase in demand. And do you have a time frame for when that might be available? Will that be publicly available? Yes, yes, absolutely. So iteratively during this year, I think probably the first time that we will be able to publish something will be in June, but finalised in the early autumn.
You said that didn't seem to be out of line with what you're hearing from other public bodies, is that right? It's
exactly the same, certainly for the other Ombudsman, and I think, by just reading anecdotally of other bodies, we are in line, but we're working closely with the other Ombudsman to see, what insights they are taking, and also, of course, in the devolved.
Thank you. We'll obviously, as a committee, be very interested in that work when it's available. Marcus Campbell-Savers.
Just picking up on your questions about the gap between the public perception and the findings of transgression. I wondered whether, and this is a question for both of you really, whether we're seeing an increase in the number of people who are using the standard system, weaponising the standard system to malign people. It's the emails you get where as an MP where people say they've reported people to the police because the moment you've done that, there's a perception that there must be something wrong. People using the idea that investigations have been opened based on initial evidence to undermine people. Is there a sense that that's happening, and are there any lessons to be learnt about how we manage that?
Happy to go first on that one, Daniel, if that's okay. So we do know one of the drivers of demand is, of course, AI enabled. And that enables complainants to, or rather generally ChatGPT will enable throwing the kitchen sink at it. But whenever there is a technology shift one way, there's always a technology response as well. It does it raises expectations, of course. The extent to which citizens know that AI is not infallible is to be questioned, and it means that we have to work harder to explain why this particular code or this particular jurisdiction or this particular point doesn't apply to your particular complaint. So yes.
If I may.
Could I just, I think I should almost declare an interest here. I was subject to a standards complaint when I was first elected, and which was closed following a review very quickly. And so I just want to make that clear. That's part of my interest in this.
Thank you.
And obviously, Chair, neither you nor the member will expect me to comment on any particular case at all. But I would like to make some comments on the general principle underpinning the question. I'm not in a position to say whether there is an increase in what you describe as weaponisation, but I certainly can confirm that it is something that I take very seriously, and I think it does happen clearly. And there are two things that I think are really important to say about it. The first is that the process as set out in the procedural protocol, the process set out in other ways for other sorts of complaint, has to be able to move very quickly to identify vexatious complaints or simply erroneous complaints, and my emphasis there is on the word quickly, because clearly for members of Parliament, which is the only forum that I can speak about, reputational damage of being under an investigation is significant, and I must be able to deliver to members a reassurance that their cases are being dealt with very fast, and as fast as is consistent with proper management of evidence gathering, and that cases that are wholly without merit fall out of the system as quickly as possible. But the second point I would make is this. Having said that, motive for a complaint is not and must not matter to me. I look at a complaint that's come forward and I treat every single complaint with exactly the same way through the process set out by the House-approved procedural protocol, and ultimately, if a member has breached the code, if a breach is found, then that is what matters, that the House acknowledges and deals with the breach. The motive for the complaint is not a matter for me. So those are my two reflections. Very important to deal with vexatious allegations properly and quickly, but also motive is not a matter for me.
Could I ask a quick follow-on on that? I mean, are you seeing an increase in the quantity of complaints being submitted in the same way that Paula has suggested the PHSO are?
Year on year, and the statistics on this are set out in my annual reports to the House, so it's available to be seen. I can't say that there's a sort of there's a consistent trend of massive increase in quite the same way that Paula has described. We get some years we get blips. I mean, 3 years ago we had 5,500 complaints. The following year was only 2,500 complaints. Then last year was back up to 3,000. So there's a little bit of I think danger in trying to identify trends, particularly when I'm talking about such relatively small numbers compared to the sort of tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands that other bodies are dealing with. So don't identify a trend, but that doesn't mean that I don't take the underlying point that you've made seriously, because I do.
Marcus, you want to just take us through the final couple of questions?
Sure. Paula, your office looks at where government has not acted properly and the procedures for handling complaints about this. What is your view on the system for standards of ministers, where ministers are appointed by the Prime Minister and then held to a set of rules determined and then judged and decided on by the Prime Minister?
Marcus, I think that's out with my remit.
A different question then. The PHSO has the powers to make recommendations for change and redress, but does not have the powers to require change or compel redress. How do you think this impacts those who use your services and the wider public trust in government?
That's a very good question, and that one I will definitely answer. So the first thing to say is we do have a very high compliance rate with our recommendations, which is generally, it's right up in the 90s, 99% or something like that across all the thousands of complaints that we finalise. Some of that is because, Marcus, we work very hard with the organisations to come to an acceptance of what has gone wrong. And it is important that our organisation is able to work to improve public service, so working with other agencies, but working also with the organisations we investigate. The question goes to having enforcement powers, I think in some respects, yes, of course, you could do that, but it makes it harder to work with organisations. If I give you examples of particularly visiting health trusts, which I and my chief executive do on a monthly basis, they look to the Ombudsman as also a source of what's good, what's right, how can we do this better, how would you advise us to use these complaints. This is how we look at the insights and the patient stories at board level. What do you think about that? So we get a very open reception so we can work with those organisations. There's a degree of trust, which with enforcement powers you might not get. And I think the second thing is we regard Parliament as our enforcement arm. So, if anything, we want to work more with your committee, select committees, in terms of revealing where we are not happy, as you say, with performance in public service. But we do want to, generally with recommendations, it is part of our strategy that we're actually going to follow through further and harder on them, particularly in some of the more systemic or larger cases where we really do want to follow through to see how the culture has changed, how the process changes have been made, are they sticking, are you slipping back, etc.
I mean, you have the power to lay a report before Parliament. Mm-hmm. How effective a measure do you feel that is?
It can be, as is public record. It's certainly got the attention of the Charity Commission quite recently. So absolutely, it can be.
And are there more powers that you feel that you should have? Things that you think would be useful?
I am sure we could, but I think we need to focus on what we can do with our existing powers, our resources, our data, and the relationships that we build with the organisations around us and the organisations we investigate to go further and harder within what we have at the moment.
Thank you both. Just a final question from me. We've obviously talked about the EIC and the broader standards landscape, and particularly what the government has been doing over the last 18 months or so. Are there any other reforms to improve the standards landscape that you would be recommending to the government, or you would be hoping that they would be pursuing?
I wouldn't describe it exactly as a reform, but I would, if this is my parting shot, do not underestimate the scale of the operationalisation task of this. We do need to get this right.
Daniel?
So from my side, I think it's very important that we constantly monitor the operation of the standards, the part of the standard system for which I'm responsible. And of course, the Standards Committee has, broadly speaking, a 5-year rolling review function. As we're coming towards the end of my 5-year tenure, I am already beginning to think about the representations that I will make to them for specific reforms, and they will then they will consider those, and then they will open up a consultation in whatever form they think right. So we, on our side, we have this rolling, constant checking what's gone wrong, what's been what people don't understand, what could be clearer, and I have an opportunity to feed that in through the committee once every 5-year period, and I think that's a really positive and useful process.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. I think ending on the importance of the operational aspects and the implementation are very important. So just thank you both very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.